Welcome, and thank you for joining today's conference, Market Surveillance Committee meeting. Before we begin, please ensure that you open the chat panel by using the associated icon located at the bottom of your screen. If you require technical assistance, please send a chat to the event producer. To enter the question queue, please press #2 on your telephone keypad. With that, I'll turn the call over to Dr. Benjamin Hobbs, Chair of the Market Surveillance Committee. Please go ahead.
Okay. Thank you, Janelle, and thank you to everybody who's called in. During this call, we're going to be considering adoption of an opinion on resource adequacy enhancements, in particular the minimum state of charge requirements proposal. But before we do so, I'll first introduce the folks who are on the call, and then as always, I'm going to give an opportunity for folks who are on the line to make any comments that they would like to make about other issues. We do not have any minutes to consider for adoption at this time. So with me today are the other two members of the Market Surveillance Committee, Jim Bushnell and Scott Harvey. And then from the ISO, we have Greg Cook, Guillermo Bautista, Anna McKenna, Brad Cooper, Gabe Murtaugh, and Shami Davis. Is there anybody else from the ISO here?
John Gooden's here.
Great. Glad you could make it, John. Okay, so the first order of business is to see whether there are any comments or questions that stakeholders would like to ask either of us or staff about any issue aside from the issue that we'll be addressing in the opinion. So, Janelle, could you see whether anybody would like to raise their hand and make a comment or ask a question?
Sure. As a reminder, please dial #2 on your telephone keypad to make a comment or ask a question. No one in the queue at this time.
Okay. All right, then. Well, what we'll do is I will summarize the opinion. I'll check to see whether Jim and Scott would like to add any additional comments, and then we'll open it up to the callers for questions and comments, then to be followed by the vote. So this is one of 3 opinions we're doing over this 2-month period. The other 2 opinions have addressed the readiness initiative for this summer. This opinion also addresses readiness for the summer, but it's an element of the resource adequacy enhancements phase 1, and this is the minimum state of charge requirements for storage. So what this element does is define what I call an MSOC, a minimum state of charge requirement, for certain short-term energy storage facilities that are under resource adequacy contract in the CAISO market. The requirement would be imposed only under certain specified conditions. So let me give a little bit of background on the motivation for this, the proposal itself, and then our analysis of some of its features. So as was identified in the ESDR 4 proposal and our opinion on that, there's some issues with management of battery storage in real time. In particular, the ISO's real-time markets have a short time horizon, shorter than what you need to fully optimize the use of the batteries. And so as a result, there is a risk that batteries will be prematurely discharged or will not be sufficiently charged because the real-time optimization does not see the value of that storage of discharging past the time horizon of the real-time market. Now, there's several reasons why this premature discharge or insufficient charging can occur. One is the short time horizon. Another one is the possibility of the exercise of market power, where owners of other resources might see it advantageous to discharge a battery early so that there's insufficient energy available during the peak period and thus raising prices at that time. Yet another reason is that because of inadequate scarcity pricing in the ISO markets, prices during the evening peak, which are likely to be the times of greatest system stress, not necessarily, but likely to be the times of greatest system stress, may not see prices that are sufficiently higher than prices during the day. There may be stress during the day, greater stress in the evening, and prices could be at their maximum level at both times, which would mean that charging during the day could not be justified, at least from the point of view of the software or the point of view of the owner of the resource, to justify the storage losses, the round-trip losses you get if you charge during the day and discharge in the evening. So the fixes for these, fundamental fixes for these could be extending the time horizon of the real-time markets, perhaps turning the hour-ahead market into a full market that looks over many hours, or having a process which acquires storage. But since none of those things are possible before the summer, and of course another solution would be, the problem is inadequate prices. Another solution could be implementation of full scarcity pricing in the ISO's markets. Those can't be implemented by the summer. However, what the ISO proposes in terms of the minimum state of charge is something that could be implemented by the summer. And so what that involves is a requirement that just those batteries that are contracted for RA attain a level of charge specified by the ISO prior to the evening peak. I'll describe that in a little bit more detail in a minute. This will be imposed only on batteries that provide RA and only on those days in which the day-ahead residual unit commitment process, including RA battery resources, shows a deficiency in a given hour. The ISO would also have discretion to relax that requirement. Perhaps the RUC process shows a deficiency, but things turn out to look better in real time. On the other hand, during days in which RUC does not show a deficiency, but conditions tighten up in real time, the ISO would also have the discretion to impose a minimum state of charge requirement. This state of charge requirement will be related to the state of charge scheduled in the day-ahead market. In general, such a requirement has been controversial among storage owners who would understandably prefer to be given more rather than less flexibility to manage storage based on their assessment of system conditions and expected market prices. So there were a lot of comments received in response to an earlier version of this, which would have been imposed originally proposed, would have been imposed all days. The ISO has since modified the proposal to only impose it on certain stress days, as I just described. The stakeholders basically view this as antithetical to a philosophy of markets that would give discretion to resource owners to operate their resources as they saw fit in response to market incentives subject to market power mitigation. But because of the inadequate time horizons of real-time markets and the primacy of the reliability objective, something that we've been reminded of during the August and February events in California and Texas, other stakeholders are going along with this requirement and feel that it's justified to require that RA contracted storage be adequately charged prior to the evening's net load peak intervals. We do recognize that the long-run solution is to set prices that set an efficient solution for decentralized operation of storage in both the day-ahead and real-time markets, but that will not be done by this summer. In response to these voiced concerns, the ISO has recently announced we'll start an initiative for developing a competitive process in spot markets for meeting overall storage targets, as opposed to requirement on a resource-by-resource basis, but that can't be completed this summer. In addition, as I'll note later, such an auction, if implemented, there are a number of issues in designing it that preclude it from it being done quickly and conceivably also risk some unintended consequences. Okay, so first of all,
Ben?
Yeah.
Ben, this is Greg. I just wanted to put in a little clarification. We have made a slight modification to the proposal, and this was included in our board memo, and we just recently, just today, posted a revised draft of our final proposal. But the slight change is that we're now saying that we would impose the minimum state of charge when there's a RUC in feasibility, and the operators then would have the flexibility to release that minimum state of charge in the event that things got better, the forecast wasn't necessarily as high, or new supply showed up in real time, but they would not have the ability to impose the state of charge in the event that there wasn't a RUC in feasibility. So it would only be imposed if there's a RUC in feasibility. So we did make that slight change to give more certainty to stakeholders that this would only be imposed at the most when there's a RUC in feasibility, where the operators would only have the discretion to release the minimum state of charge, not impose it in the real time.
Okay, thanks for pointing that out, Greg. Of course, the operators will retain the option to exceptionally dispatch storage, and under this initiative, they'll also have visibility into state of charge, so that if real-time conditions show that that things look too good day ahead and some sort of management state of charge is needed. Am I correct in assuming that the operators would be able to, in effect, impose a charging schedule, or which would translate it to a state, is in effect a state of charge requirement, even if it's not formally called a minimum state of charge requirement? It would, in effect, still effectuate the same thing, so as to ensure there's enough energy in the evening. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct, Ben. They'd still have the authority to do exceptional dispatch as needed to maintain reliability.
Okay. So in effect, it might not be different. I guess this might impose a little bit more stress on operators should they find themselves in that circumstance, because the exceptional dispatch would have to be imposed on a resource-by-resource basis. Okay, so going on to our analysis, our general conclusion is that we do agree that a rigid minimum state of charge constraint for RA batteries does have the potential for inefficiencies and unintended outcomes. And all else being equal, giving operational flexibility to resource owners is desirable as long as market prices were efficient and you had sufficient look ahead in the real-time markets, or were other means of managing the state of charge. But that's not the situation now, and so we agree that as a temporary measure for this summer and then the following summer, that this is justified. So we believe that imposing state of charge constraints in these hopefully rare conditions when the residual unit commitment indicates that capacity is inadequate is indeed a reasonable precaution to take, at least until the end-of-hour state of charge parameter feature is enabled and tested in operation. Implementation of something that's more comprehensive and market-oriented to managing this is something that we look forward to helping the ISO design later, but that's going to kind of have to come later. Now, we do note that there are potential issues in terms of counterproductive charging behavior right before or after the minimum state of charge interval. And the stakeholders highlighted some battery charging behavior during for example, the August 2020 heat wave and subsequently in September. And stakeholders did offer what they saw as a potential solution to this in terms of a safety protocol that would limit real-time charging. It would limit that to just exceptional dispatches. We concluded that such a protocol would be unwise for 3 reasons. First, there's a high likelihood it would be suboptimal since the charging restriction would be imposed regardless of system conditions during the intervals in which it is applied. So that obviates the balancing features of storage at those times. Second, this would require more operator attention and efforts, and that will be exacerbating demands on operators rather than assisting the operators. Third, implementation of such a protocol would be more complex than just the minimum state of charge requirement, and we note that many stakeholders expressed an opinion that that what the ISO is proposing to implement before the summer between this and the readiness initiative was already an awful lot on the plate, and there were concerns as to whether they would be whether these implementations would be successful without problems, and so piling on a bit more complexity we don't think would be a good idea. Since the operators, as I just noted, always have the option of imposing exceptional dispatch restrictions, in particular on charging behavior anytime during the operating day, either before the MSOC period or after, we don't see a great advantage to attempting prior to June 1 to formalize such restrictions as a safety protocol. Now, if it turns out that experience this coming summer indicates that such restrictions are useful and predictable, then development of such a protocol could be justified for the summer of 2022, which is the second year of the 2-year durations proposal. We do note that in the final proposal, the ISO proposed the use of a parameter to spread out possible charging behavior over intervals immediately preceding the evening net load peak hours, and this could partially help avoid the problems that the stakeholder proposed safety protocol would attempt to address. Choosing the parameters for that is going to require some judgment and a balancing between the need for flexibility and the need to avoid the risk of high charge rates during intervals prior to that. The proposal was necessarily a bit vague on this point, and the ISO is going to need to be flexible and observant of the impacts of doing so, and especially on the guard for any unintended consequences. Now, returning to the counterintuitive charging of storage during the system warning and emergency conditions that were noted by stakeholders, this is indeed a serious concern, and we believe it was due to the inappropriate market pricing that occurred, in which low real-time prices occurred due to the release of generation that was providing reserves for dispatch when that generation was replaced by arming load, when in fact the system was still actually highly stressed and approaching load shedding. And as we discussed, in particular, Scott discussed during our call a couple weeks ago on the readiness initiative, this is being addressed by the scarcity pricing portion of the readiness proposal, and we think should be become less of an issue. Another issue raised by stakeholders is compensation for opportunity costs. Some stakeholders are arguing for their reimbursement if they result from imposing the MSOC constraint. As we discussed in our ESDR 4 initiative, estimating these things is very difficult. But what can be observed is when, at least at the margin, charging earlier in the day and then discharging during the evening period has resulted in a marginal loss, in the sense that the cost of charging plus the cost of losses exceeds the revenue gotten during the evening peak. And if that charging was due to the minimum state of charge constraint, a case can be made that perhaps they should be made whole. And certainly if the batteries overall lost money over the day, there's an argument to be made for make whole payments. So we think it'd be useful to the ISO to estimate and report losses and gains when enforcing the MSOC constraint, and then if indeed those are significant, they could consider implementing such a make whole payment provision. Although such compensation for just losses might be appreciably less than the full opportunity cost, it would provide some assurance that the minimum state of charge would not result in negative profits. In other words, keep an eye out early in the summer to show whether such losses are material or not, and also try to quantify opportunity costs. The final thing I'd just like to say is that the ISO has agreed to develop an auction for state of charge the system, and the objective of such a thing is to give more flexibility to storage, and perhaps that might take more account of, for example, opportunity costs. There are several challenging conceptual and practical issues in designing that. We are concerned that these issues are not necessarily minor or even solvable, and it could be that adding such an auction could yield unanticipated consequences, and that the scarcity pricing enhancements initiative that's planned would represent a more fundamental reform that would better achieve the objectives. This is not a hard and fast conclusion on just merely stating our opinion that there will be interesting issues associated with the design of this, and that such an auction may not be the best solution to the issues that is intended to address. And with that, I'll conclude the summary and ask whether Jim or Scott, do you have anything to add?
Not Scott.
Not Jim either.
Okay. Thanks for everybody's input on the opinion, Jim and Scott, and of course staff. This was a team effort. Janelle, can you see if there's anybody on the phone lines who would like to make a statement or comment at this time?
Sure. As a reminder, please press #2 on your telephone keypad to enter the queue. No one in the queue at this time. As a reminder, you may dial #2 to enter the queue to make a comment or ask a question. And no one in the queue at this time.
Okay, thanks, Janelle. Okay, so we're ready then to move to a vote, and I'll take a motion to adopt the opinion.
Scott moves to adopt the opinion.
Jim seconds the motion.
Okay, it's been moved by Dr. Harvey and seconded by Dr. Bushnell to adopt the opinion on the resource adequacy enhancements minimum state of charge. Let me ask if there are any amendments or changes, and I'll offer one. Given what the change that Greg just informed us of, I would like to add a footnote that in an appropriate place in the opinion that makes note of that change and references that change. I guess I should make that then a formal amendment to this motion. Do I have a second on that?
Scott will
Yeah,
second.
this is Jim. Beat me to it.
Okay. Okay. Any discussion of it?
No.
If not, okay. If not, I'll take a vote. Scott, this is a vote on the amendment to add a footnote to the opinion noting the change that Greg Cook just noted in the proposal. Scott?
Yes.
Vote. Jim?
Yes.
And I vote yes, so the amendment's been adopted unanimously. Any other changes, typos? I noticed I made a reference to batter rather than battery at one point. I must have been hungry. I will correct that typo. That doesn't need a motion. Any other changes?
No.
Nope.
Okay. If there are no more changes, then I'll go ahead and take a vote. This is the vote to adopt the opinion as amended. Scott?
Yes.
Jim?
Yes.
And I vote yes. So the opinion on resource adequacy enhancements, in particular the minimum state of charge component of that initiative, the opinion as amended has been unanimously adopted, and the final version of this, including the footnote, will be posted in the next day or two. And we will be discussing that at the board meet. Actually, it'll be posted before the board meeting tomorrow, if I'm not mistaken. And we'll be discussing it before the board at that time, as well as our summer readiness opinion. Do either of you have any other business, or does the staff have any other business they want to bring to our attention?
Not from Scott.
Not from Jim either.
Okay. I have no further business either, so I will therefore conclude the meeting, and many of you, we will be online with you tomorrow during the Board of Governors meeting. Thank you very much for attending today. And Janelle, we can conclude the call.
That concludes our conference. Thank you for using Event Services. You may now disconnect.